Hello everyone, I am Byung-Young Kim, Chairman of the new Consilience Group NCG. I would like to take this opportunity to show clearly how over the past 2000 years Christianity has distorted the true teachings of Jesus, known as the New Covenant or New Testament. The message Jesus brought was not merely a set of rules or ethics, it was a new dimension of promise, the New Covenant, which completely overturned the existing religious system. Jesus rejected the legal framework of the Old Testament and presented a new worldview, a new human perspective, and a new understanding of God. However, the Roman Empire, the papacy, and the subsequent Christian world failed to fully embrace the spirit of the New Testament. They made a grave mistake by force-fitting the Old Testament onto Jesus' teachings and mixing the Old Covenant with the New Testament instead of establishing a new order. The 1987 Constitution of the Sixth Republic of Korea clearly broke with the dictatorial Yushin Constitution and established a new order. To claim that the Yushin Constitution is still valid would be a legal and moral error, indeed a crime. The same is true of the United States. In the late 18th century, it fought a war of independence to free itself from the constraints of the Church of England-centered order. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights, grounded in conscience, were not only a rejection of monarchy, but also marked a historic severance of the old ties between religion and power, and the birth of a republican order. Even today, some European countries, including the United Kingdom, still retain monarchies, but the American choice clearly contrasted a monarchical system with a republican one. Yet today, under the banner of Christian democracy, we witness churches reverting to an Old Testament order. Instead of remaining a path of liberation toward truth, Christianity often regresses into an authoritarian doctrinal system. Although Jesus proclaimed the New Covenant, many Christian denominations and Islam as well continue to base themselves on the Old Testament. This historical error weakens and distorts Jesus' message by combining two incompatible systems. Today, I present 10 rebuttals of scriptural distortions identified through my study. Each theme will be explored in greater depth in upcoming videos. I welcome counter arguments and public debate. If evidence proves any claim here false, I will gladly examine it. But if you find these arguments persuasive, I ask you to acknowledge the distortions of the Old Testament-based religion and join the religious revolution to restore Jesus' true teachings. Now I will list the 10 rebuttal themes in order. First, Jesus rejected the Old Testament God Yahweh, identifying him as the devil. He describes the being followed by the Jewish religious leaders as a murderer from the beginning and the father of lies, John 8:44, thus making clear his break with the Old Testament Yahweh, and he introduced the new God inherent in each human being. However, Christianity later fused these two fundamentally different beings under a two-word name, Yahweh God, which is a serious distortion of Jesus' original message. Second, the tithe was a tax in the Old Testament state system. It was not a voluntary offering, but a tax levied by the theocratic state of Israel. Moses offered the tithe paid by the 11 tribes of Israel to Yahweh, and a tenth of that was allocated to the Levites for carrying out religious ceremonies and maintaining their livelihood. As the Levites originally served as priests, the 10% of the tithe was used to operate the tabernacle and temple, to hold festivals, and to support the poor. However, today's churches have distorted this system by turning it into an oppressive institution that forces believers to pay the entire tithe, despite it being a tax owed to the state. Third, the afterlife doctrine is a Renaissance error hybrid. Jesus emphasized the present and imminent kingdom of heaven, saying the kingdom of God is within you, Luke 17:21. However, the church later blended Hellenism, medieval mysticism, and Renaissance imagery to reinforce heaven, hell, and purgatory, and used these doctrines to control believers. The earthly realization of divine law was erased, and external rewards and punishments in the afterlife were emphasized. Fourth, the Exodus of Moses is not a verified historical fact, although it is central to the Old Testament narrative. Neither Egypt's extensive records nor archaeology corroborate a mass Israelites' departures. Even the extensive inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses II, whom the Vatican identifies as the Exodus pharaoh, show no trace of such event. Nevertheless, many Christians uphold a literal reading and sanctify the Old Testament's fictionalized history. Jesus said, "The truth will set you free," John 8:32. Ignoring the truth in favor of mythology betrays the New Testament and Jesus. The fifth, Judah was a small state that only emerged after the Israel fall. The united monarchy of David and Solomon appears to be a late Judahite construction to bolster its authority. Judah took shape as refugees arrived after the destruction of Israel in BC 722. Treating the whole Old Testament as reliable history subordinated the New Testament to a fabricated political narrative. Jesus' message completely rejects priestly power and nationalist mythology. The sixth, resurrection and ascension narratives served a deification program. Jesus taught heaven on earth and the restoration of each person's divine nature, Godhood. However, the imperial church adopted Rome's tradition of emperor deification, creating mystic narratives of resurrection and ascension. Consequently, Jesus thus became chiefly an object of worship. Resurrection was systemized into a doctrine of redemption. The seventh, the missing gospel of Jesus Christ should be made public. The phrase "the gospel of Jesus Christ," repeated in Mark and in the original epistles of Paul, does not survive today as an original document. If the Vatican is concealing it, this deprives humanity of its intellectual and spiritual life. Should the gospel exist, it must be released to recover the new law in its original form. The eighth, the Trinity was an imperial church construction in the 4th century. At the councils of Nicaea 325 and Constantinople 381, a blend of theology and philosophy was adopted as part of the imperial ruling strategy. The term and the doctrine of the Trinity does not appear explicitly in the original text of the Bible. Jesus taught union with the divine, John 17, not metaphysical definitions of essence and persons. The ninth, the perpetual virginity myth of Mary is a later fabrication. The Bible mentions Jesus' biological siblings, which suggests that the possibility of Mary's subsequent marriage and family. Catholicism, however, defined Mary as ever virgin, combining the secularization of motherhood with the mystification of womanhood, an example of religious myth-making. The 10th, Genesis creation narratives conflict with scientific. Genesis 1 contains two distinct creation accounts which conflict with the basic findings of modern science. Jesus did not emphasize worshipping a distant creator, but rather called for awakening to the Godhood within. These 10 rebuttals converge on one principle. Jesus broke away from the old law and offered the new covenant, the New Testament. However, the church has remained bound to the Old Testament of Judaism, the Old Testament. These 10 rebuttals are an attempt to clarify the meaning of this breakaway led by Jesus. We must now dismantle distortional doctrines and restore the truth teachings of Jesus. That is the religious revolution the new Consilience group pursue. In future videos, we will explore each rebuttal in depth. Please join in restoring truth and divinity. Thank you very much.